Welcome to A Drink with John. I am coming to you this time from Rome, the Eternal City, getting ready to travel with Pope Francis to Egypt. This conversation is part of our series sponsored by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and their Fortnight for Freedom campaign. That is an annual push that runs every year from June 21st to July 4th, intended to raise awareness and respect for religious liberty in the United States. We are, in this series, we are talking to some of the most interesting Catholic minds in America, and today we are honored and delighted to be joined by one of the most fascinating Catholic personalities in America, a writer and thinker by the name of Colleen Carroll Campbell. If you are not reading Colleen's stuff, you definitely should be, because this is somebody who has interesting things to say about basically every issue of Catholic concern in America. And we're going to be talking to her about religious freedom and many matters beyond. Colleen, how you doing today?
Great, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Now, listen, before we get to some of the other things, start on religious freedom, because that is the topic of this series. I did a book on anti-Christian persecution, and I interviewed persecuted Christians in various parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and so on. In America, Christians do not take their lives in their hands every time they go to church on Sunday. And so from a certain point of view, it is easy to think that there really aren't any issues with the religious freedom in the United States. But, the truth of it is that the Catholic bishops here and many others are concerned that we are on a slippery slope that kind of leads to an erosion for respect for religious freedom in America. Tell us how you see it.
Well, I think that's right, John. And certainly nobody's saying that we're in the same situation as Christians in many places overseas who, as you said, are literally, dying for the faith. But I think it's important to remember two things. The first thing is that America was basically a country founded by people fleeing religious persecution. And we've always been a beacon, as long as we've been around, to those who have longed for religious freedom. They've looked to America as an inspiration of how people in a pluralistic democracy can learn to live together peaceably without giving up their deepest convictions. And I think that second piece is very important, because that's more and more what we're seeing today. That's where the challenge is today. No, there's not an armed guard blocking you from walking into the church on Sunday. But increasingly as a Catholic, it's very difficult in your work, in public life, and more just in everyday situations to openly defend the teachings of our faith, those that are more controversial and more at odds with the prevalent culture. So you've got, anything from Catholic hospitals' refusal to do a gender reassignment surgery, or obviously abortion and contraception are hot button issues, the definition of marriage and what it even means to be male and female, created by God. These are things that are an integral part of our Catholic faith. And when we're getting into a situation, which we are more and more in the United States, where we can't speak openly about those because we are perceived then as trampling on someone else's feelings or their civil rights, we're getting into a place where religious freedom is becoming redefined as the right to worship. And we're not called to defend the right to worship. It's the right to religious freedom in its entire robust meaning, which is to be a Catholic in public and private life. So that's what the bishops are concerned about, and they have an ample reason to be. As a member of their ad hoc committee on religious liberty, I hear every meeting, about every 3 months, we get together and we hear the updates on the bills that are working their way through state legislatures, in municipalities, and certainly federal threats to religious liberty. And they get worse every time. And they're really chilling things that I think a lot of Americans and a lot of American Catholics simply aren't aware of. The second thing I would say, too, is it's important to remember that we need to be vigilant, because we don't want to wait until it gets to a situation where things are completely out of control and people are actually, in the sort of situations that we see our brothers and sisters overseas in. And if we think that's impossible and that could never happen in America, I think we need only look at the people who are already facing criminal sanctions for refusing to participate, for instance, as vendors at gay weddings. I mean, we really need to look carefully at what's happening and a little bit, kind of get our heads out of the sand, because I think sometimes we just take religious freedom for granted and we figure it could never be otherwise. This is America. But, America is only as strong as any given generation of Americans are at that moment. And if our generation loses the sense of why religious liberty matters, then we will soon lose religious liberty.
Colleen, there are a lot of people who think that the bishops are basically overreacting here. The reality is that America is a very tolerant and pluralistic and accepting society, that things are basically fine, and that by making a fetish out of religious freedom, the bishops are basically engaging in the wars of culture. Explain why what the bishops are trying to do here through the Fortnight for Freedom campaign is actually an appropriate response to contemporary realities in America.
Well, I think that the number one reason it's appropriate is because they are shepherds. They're leaders, and we believe as Catholics that they've been given that authority by God to lead us on these issues. So I think when they don't lead, or they don't lead forcefully, it actually leaves lay Catholics who are fighting in the trenches on these issues abandoned and feeling like, well, if the bishop doesn't think this is worth standing up for, why should I? So I think it's very important that the bishops are out there. And I can say that most of them, they grew up just wanting to be pastors. They were not looking for a fight. And most of them would be more than happy if all of these legal threats went away yesterday to drop it. So this is not a fight that the bishops or the Catholic Church is looking for, but it's been dropped in our laps, and I think we have to respond. And I think it's important to remember, too, every day, whether it's a Catholic doctor trying to stand up at his hospital to say, I don't think it's appropriate that we should be, doing procedures that, threaten human life or contradict church teachings, or, doing gender reassignment on minors. These things are happening, and sometimes, unfortunately, they're happening, or at least winked at in Catholic settings. And so the bishops are trying to stand up and speak out, and they're calling on us as lay Catholics to do the same. And I think it's important we remember that this is, in some sense, the fight of lay Catholics more than anyone, because we're the ones who have to be out there day to day. And, in terms of those who think this isn't a real threat, just try telling that to those who've already lost their jobs and been hauled before civil rights commissions because they would not agree to someone else's redefinition of marriage, for instance. So there's sometimes this sense of, well, these hot button issues, why don't you get past them? I think a lot of Catholics and a lot of bishops would love to get past them, but they're not allowed to. More and more, what started as tolerance has become indoctrination, and a sense that you not only will tolerate this, you must endorse it, and in some cases participate in it. And if you don't, then we will treat you as a bigot and as someone who is criminally liable. And I think that's a scary step for us in America, and we should be pushing back hard, because this is the time we still can. If we let it go on too much further, there may be a point of no return on this.
Colleen, the battle lines on religious freedom are pretty clear during the Obama years, right? I mean, the showcase issue there were the contraception mandates that were imposed as an aspect of healthcare reform. And, the tug of war between the Obama administration and the Bishops' Conference were well known. I mean, now that we're in the Donald Trump area, what would you say would be the kind of emerging religious freedom issues under this administration and with its particular agenda?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. The first is I think any serious committed Catholic or Christian who thinks that because Donald Trump is president, now we can kind of wash our hands of this issue and not worry about it. We'll just trust him to follow up on this. I mean, I think that's very naive. I think it's naive in general to think any single political candidate can reverse a trend that has been dangerous and heading in the wrong direction for decades. And I don't think we saw any signs in the campaign that this was an issue that was at the core of Donald Trump's agenda. And I will say, of course, that I think the current administration is obviously less antagonistic on this issue at this point than the previous one. So I'm not saying there's no difference. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. And I don't think we're in a state in America anymore where we can vote for X or Y politician, or we can see that so-and-so got in this or that office, and therefore we don't have to watch this stuff. Unfortunately, you know, politicians of all stripes are very liable to cave on this issue. They're getting strong pressure, and more the bullying is coming from the big business sector, which is one that is, of course, cozy with the Republican Party, you know, and has as much influence there, or maybe more as in the Democratic Party. So this is not a partisan issue. And when people say the bishops are being partisan by fighting this issue, you know, obviously, when you've got a party that's actively promoting abortion rights, for instance, it's going to be a much different scene when that party is running things. But, you know, we have seen Republicans cave on this issue. We've seen Republicans refuse to stand up because their big business clients don't want them to. So I think we really, as Catholics, need to focus on the fact that we're Catholics first. We defend this principle, and we defend it wherever and with whomever we need to, whether it's with those we consider political allies or not. The second issue is I think we need to look at the state legislatures and what's going on in municipalities and what's working its way just through city councils. That's where a lot of the fight is these days. You know, and if that's true on the pro-life issue, it's true on just the general issue of kind of gag orders on those who don't say the right thing, won't go along with the program on anything from the redefinition of marriage to gender identity, transgender issues, all of it. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to what's going on in our own backyards. Again, I think it's tempting to watch the national news focus on the national scene, over which a lot of us don't have a whole lot of control, and ignore what's happening in your own backyard, where you can speak up and oust these people who are, you know, trying to force something down your children's throats at school, or you know, force something on others in your community that isn't really compatible with our American ideals of religious liberty.
Yeah, I mean, you are so right in that it is enormously tempting to focus on what's on the TV news tonight, because that's what's in our face, and kind of ignore the bigger picture. But listen, you know, before we have to let you go, Colleen, I am told that these days you are writing on the topic of spiritual perfectionism. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, I am. I'm working on a new project, and this is just an issue that caught my attention. I think perfectionism, we've seen a lot in our culture, signs that this is an issue in our culture. And I'm talking now about the hyper-competitive culture, everything from the tiger moms to the helicopter parents to, you know, the uptick in everything from plastic surgery and eating disorders, body image disorders, you name it. Even the sad surge that we've seen at elite colleges and universities in suicides among students who seem to be doing everything perfectly and yet felt they were not making the mark and needed to take their lives. So there have been a lot of signs of this in our culture for years, but what I think has sometimes been overlooked is the spiritual angle on this problem. The fact that especially as Catholics, and I would say even especially as committed Catholics, the kind who follow Christ, for instance, who care a lot about their faith and want to do what they need to do in the world for God, in their families, in their homes, sometimes just losing sight of the fact that we are really children of God who need to be focused more on gospel perfection as opposed to perfection as the world defines it. And so it's just an issue that I've begun to give more and more talks on, and has interested me in a longer project. And what's interested me particularly is to see how this manifests in the lives of committed Catholics who would never say out loud that I think I need to do X, Y, or Z to be a good human being, for God to love me, etc. But who find that they're slipping into the culture's competitive ethos and applying that to their life of faith, and who look only to the secular culture for answers. And where I think it's interesting to look is the lives of the saints. How many of the saints, and I wrote about in my last book, My Sisters the Saints, how various women saints have helped me sort through some of my questions as a woman in our contemporary culture. But it's interesting. I didn't want to turn to the saints on this question because I figured, well, you know, if anything, they would probably make the situation worse if you're already driving yourself a bit too hard or losing sight of God's mercy or whatever it is. It's interesting, though, if you look at the lives of the saints, so many of them struggled with a version of this themselves. They didn't call it spiritual perfectionism, of course, but they struggled with this, and it was often that struggle which became their means of sanctification. And so I think it's good to look to them. on everything from how we're raising our children to how we're dealing with some of these cultural challenges. There's a real temptation, I think, to dig in, to become angry, judgmental, feel that, you know, I just have to stiffen up and be even tougher. And I have to be better, better, better in order to be the kind of Catholic God wants me to be. And there's, I think, sometimes an understanding of mercy that's very flimsy and not as appealing to more committed Catholics. And they don't understand that the real pursuit of gospel perfection often looks nothing like imitating the world's standards, looks nothing like doing what everyone around us thinks we need to be doing. And so it's just an interesting topic, and I found that it resonates especially often with parents who are struggling with the culture's pressures to be the perfect parent versus what our Catholic faith tells us we should be instilling as parents, even when it means going way against the grain, and not doing the things everybody else is doing, because it turns out they're not all that great for your kids anyway. So there are a lot of interesting angles to this. I find the saints a real inspiration in this, and I'm just enjoying digging into it, enjoying speaking about it, and looking forward to writing more deeply on it.
You have been listening to Colleen Carroll Campbell. I told you at the top, she's one of the most interesting Catholic minds and voices out there, and you now see why I said that. Talking about her new project about spiritual perfectionism and what perfection means in secular culture versus what a sort of gospel and evangelical evaluation of perfection would mean. Also had some very interesting things to say about religious liberty. This particular episode of A Drink with John is brought to you by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, organized around the quest to defend and promote respect for religious freedom in the United States. This series is going to continue on the Crux site, that is www.cruxnow.com, again www.cruxnow.com, which is your one-stop shopping destination for the best in Catholic news, analysis, and commentary. We will be bringing you other fascinating Catholic personalities talking about the subject of religious liberty. That is it for now. Be with us next time. Until then, for the entire Crux team, I am John Allen. It has been great being with you.